Well, hello there, Internet. Welcome to the channel. I hope you're doing well. I hope that day is going well with you. Today, we are going to look at or consider revealing truth about lies. What does that mean? What is the context? The context is what is happening with the whole Israel-Hamas war and the releasing of the hostages and the pause in the fighting that's been happening for 2 days and is now entering its third day, and whether or not that is actually going to hold, and whether or not they're going to actually release hostages for a third day, and whether or not Israel is going to release prisoners for a third day. The second day of release of hostages almost didn't happen because, of course, the Hamas wanted to play a very dangerous game and draw this out as long as they could, as everyone knew they would do. So now they only released them about 20 minutes before midnight or a half hour before midnight, which they did on purpose to drag it out as long as possible, get as much dramatic attention as possible. And hello, doggy. Hi, buddy. You sweetie pie. You're a sweetie pie. You smell my dog? You smell my dog. Of course you do. You're such a sweet, you're a beautiful dog. You're a beautiful dog. There's a Yofi. Yom Tov. I love getting surprised by huge dogs that jump up and say hi. Anyway, very distracting moment. That was great. Oh, great dog. Jumped up, said hello in the cutest way. Sniffing. Big dog, dude. Anyway, where was I? Oh, yes. The Palestinians almost failed to meet the midnight deadline to release the hostages. They actually missed the deadline. They were supposed to release the hostages on the second day, sometime around 4 p.m. Israel time. They didn't, of course. They waited like an additional almost 8 hours because they wanted to get attention and cause drama. And the reason that they said they were delaying it is because they said that Israel wasn't doing things according to the terms regarding releasing prisoners and supplying aid trucks, which is not true. They absolutely did. They released the prisoners on day one on time, which was supposed to be 2 hours after the release of the Israeli prisoners back into Israeli territory, and that's exactly what happened. And then the aid trucks were delivered, and on day two, those things were already ready to go when, by the time the Israeli prisoners, the hostages were released, the Palestinians who were prisoners were already ready to be released. And again, the food trucks and aid trucks and all that stuff were ready to go. And it's just the Hamas playing out drama, crying, and the reason for it is very simple. They know that their backs have been pushed back to the wall. They got their backs pushed against the wall by the Israeli army. So they're doing everything they can to drag out every last possible minute to reposition and get intel on the ground and reposition their, people on the ground who are going to continue to do the fighting with the IDF as soon as this pause in the fighting ends, whenever that is. And they're going to drag this pause in the fighting out as long as they can, because they know obviously they can't go toe-to-toe against Israel. But they knew that before October 7th, and they know that now. That's why they always rely on getting as many civilians killed as possible on their side, because that way they garner more attention and sympathy from the world of ignorant people who are, frankly, and I hate to say it, but at this point they're idiots. If you're on the side of Hamas at this point and you don't understand, even though you've been drenching yourself in the blood of their lies, right, then you're either willfully ignorant or just dumb, right, or both. You can't be naive to the facts. If you're chanting for Israel to be destroyed by Hamas, for women and children to be raped and murdered, for every man, woman, and child in Israel, regardless of age, to be murdered, right? And regardless of religion, by the way, they'll kill every Israeli if they can. They don't care what religion you are. And they'll kill every Jew around the world if they can. That's their mission. It's in their charter. It's written. It's a fact. It's been like that for almost 40 years now. They were founded in 1987. We're now in 2023, so what is that, 36 years, right? And so their backs are against the wall, and they know it. And the only chance that they have to survive being completely destroyed by the IDF is to, A, make this pause in fighting as long as possible, because the longer they're at pause in fighting, the more pressure can be applied from external forces like those idiots in the EU or those idiots in America who are applying pressure to the White House and to Israel directly and saying, no, you got to stop them and all that stuff. And that's just ridiculous nonsense, but it is what happens, and it's something that I've said is going to happen from day one. I said it's going to happen within 2 days, 3 days. People in Israel all knew that. Those who were aware, those who were awake, we all knew that was going to happen, right? Because that's always what happens. But people outside of Israel who may not have known that may have been surprised that Israel didn't get support for more than 6 hours, or a day or two or whatever the hell it was on October 7th. Like, already the next day, before Israel had even retaliated on the ground, before they sent in one soldier, right? They'd done nothing. They'd literally done nothing. They were still fighting against terrorists inside of Israel, and already, and like Hamas was running around murdering people inside of Israel, right? On October 8th, they were still shooting at people inside Israel with terrorists on the ground inside Israel, and you already had these idiots marching in support of the Palestinians on October 8th. And the reason that that may sound a little bit agitated by it, is because I think it's a very disgusting and telling situation. You just have this open anti-Semitism, let's call it what it is, Jew hatred, right? That's what it is. It's hatred of the Jews, period, end of story. And it's disgusting. And this shit should have ended when the Nazis were defeated and surrendered unconditionally. But apparently the asses of the world haven't figured that out yet, and they've bought into the lie that the Arab majority of most of the Muslim countries have been selling to each other. Not the Arabs in Israel. The Arabs in Israel, who are Israeli Arabs, frankly, most of them are extremely patriotic citizens of Israel, many of whom, by the way, serve in the IDF, and they hate the Hamas. Okay, and they're disgusted by the Palestinian National Authority. They do not like these organizations, right? Why? Because they know that the Palestinians are suffering at their hands. They know that the Palestinians would have a better life if their leaders would surrender and if they would accept peace with Israel, but they refuse to. Why? Because they're scumbags. Because they're demented scumbags, and they miseducate their people. And this all comes down to education. This whole war comes down to education, not just October 7th. The whole war. The 75-year war since Israel's independence, the 120-year war since, a little bit more than 120 years, since Herzl declared Zionism as a movement, and Jews started coming back in large numbers to the land of Israel. And there were, by the way, already Jews here, right? But just more of them started to come back, and they started to buy land from the people that sold them the land, namely the landowners who, at the time, many of whom were Arabs, but not all of them, but many of whom, most of whom, right? But even the ones that they bought the land from, right? They themselves, they took the money, they gave them the deeds, they exchanged, rights over the land. And why do they keep fighting about that today? Why do their descendants claim that that's their land today? No reason. They're just liars. They're just a culture of liars. And I hate to say it like that so blatantly, but the culture of the people that hate Israel is a culture of liars. They lie about the land exchange. They lie about the fact that, we accepted a peaceful country to be set up here, and they didn't. They lie about the fact that no Arab leader actually wanted a land called Palestine. All they wanted to do was wipe Israel from existence so it couldn't exist, and then they would establish a piece of land here, maybe, called Palestine, somewhere between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. It was never something that they actually had established when they had control of the West Bank. Well, even before Israel was established, they had control of pretty much a lot of that land, half the land, the West Bank and Gaza. The Egyptians didn't create Palestine. The Jordanians didn't create Palestine. Did they have the opportunity from 1948 to 1967 to do so? You bet, 100% they did. Did they take that opportunity and do it? No. You know why? Because they never wanted such a country. Why do you think it is that the Egyptians don't want to take the people right now who live in Gaza and at least house them as refugees from the war to escape the violence, right, in southern Gaza? Why don't they want them? You know why? Because they know that their leaders have poisoned these people's minds so much to be so violent as a culture that they don't want to host them. And it sounds terrible to say that, because obviously not every Palestinian is a violent person. Clearly, that is the case. There are many, many, many Palestinians who are not violent. And when I say many, I mean probably the majority, okay? Probably the majority. However, also probably the majority, when you ask them, especially when they're in places like Gaza or the West Bank, will tell you that they do in fact support the Hamas. Why is that a problem? It's a problem because it obviously shows that they don't actually have free speech, and they can't actually tell you what they think. And because they don't have free speech and they can't tell you what they think, it means that you actually can't know the truth about how many of them actually support Hamas, because they don't have free speech. Because like nothing close to it, right? They don't have freedom of expression. So what they say is partly out of fear, because they know the retribution for saying anything against the Hamas is basically a punishment or a sentence of death that they're imposing upon themselves, right? And let's be clear about that. Let's not sugarcoat it. The people who live in Palestinian-occupied territories, right? And I say Palestinian-occupied territories because that's what they are, right? It's the Palestinians who are occupying it. The people who live in those Palestinian-occupied territories are not free to express themselves, because their leaders, whether it's the PA or the Hamas, are both oppressive regimes. They don't allow free speech, they don't allow equal rights, they don't allow women's rights, they don't allow queer rights, LGBT rights, none of that. They don't allow any kind of liberal anything, right? They don't allow Jews to live there, into the lands that they control, unless they're hostages, right? They don't allow it. Why? Because they are extreme fundamentalist nut jobs, right? And that doesn't matter if you're talking about the secular ones or the religious ones. They're both extreme fundamentalist nut jobs. The secular ones are fundamentalist secular nut jobs. What does that mean? It means that they're not particularly religious, but fundamentally, yeah, they have their own fundamentals. They are extremists when it comes to their own fundamentals. And they hate Israel, and they don't want peace with Israel. I'm talking about the leadership, right? Even though they've signed the Oslo Accords and all this other BS, okay? They never actually made peace with Israel. And it's still in their charter to destroy Israel. And they still haven't revoked that charter, the Fatah and the PLO. They still haven't revoked that charter, right? And the PA acts as a cover to pretend like they were kind of moderates. No, they're not moderates, okay? They just wear suits and ties at the leadership level. And they say platitudes sometimes, not most of the time, right? I mean, you still have the leadership of that organization, like, still paying martyrs to kill Jews, and including both in the PA as well as the Hamas guys. Pays them too. So to say that they're moderates is a joke. And of course, on the Hamas side, those are religious extremist nut jobs who will say, disgusting things and oppress people and suppress people and repress people, because that's how they operate. So let's not sugarcoat this situation. This is a terrible situation. And yes, Israel is very happy to get, hostages back. Children, women, whatever, anybody. They want Israel wants all of its hostages back, ASAP. But the reality is the Hamas is going to drag this out as long as possible, because they figure that by dragging it out, they can get more and more pressure applied onto Israel to stop the war before it actually achieves its goals. What are its goals? To dismantle the Hamas, to remove it from power, so that it cannot govern, it cannot rule, and it cannot cause constant terror against Israel from Gaza. And the second thing is to get all the hostages back. Those are the two goals that Israel has. Those are the two reasons that Israel is still very united, because no matter what happens, Israelis know these are achievable goals. These are things that can happen if the right pressure is applied. And notice how, boastful the Hamas was at the start of this war before Israel sent in troops, and how much they're begging for the pause in the fire ever since the Israelis entered the Gaza Strip. Why? Because we've been removing, and you don't hear about it in the headlines, you have no idea how many commanders and Hamas soldiers the Israelis have been removing, right? How many terrorist guys have been shot and laid waste to or blown up? Because all you hear is these numbers, reports by Hamas itself through their so-called health ministry, telling you, oh, there's 15,000 dead civilians. Really? Well, how many of them are actually Hamas operatives? And if you wonder, well, what? You could just count the people in uniforms. No, they don't wear uniforms when they're fighting Israelis, right? Most of the time, when they're fighting Israelis in Gaza, they're wearing civilian clothes on purpose so that you can't tell who's a civilian and who's a terrorist. That way, the body count on the sympathetic side will be higher because they know the more dead civilians they have, or they can claim that they have, the more sympathy they'll get from the idiots who don't know any better, willfully or otherwise. Right, like the Red Cross or the EU or whoever, Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, who they themselves have written reports about how Hamas hides behind terrorists and, uses civilian body counts in order to garner sympathy. Those very same human rights organizations have written reports about how the Hamas abuses those human rights, and nevertheless, they still are on the side of the so-called underdog, which is not the underdog because Hamas is backed by, Qatar and Iran, and who have a lot of money and are much bigger countries than, in terms of connections, because they're part of the Muslim world, and there's, 55 members of the Muslim world altogether with like 1.5 billion people, compared to Israel that has 10 million citizens. So there's no comparison there, but the difference is that Israel is strong and united and has the resolve and the capacity to withstand these onslaughts and attacks from these disgusting idiots, because we have something on our side. Whether our politicians are liars and scumbags or not, we have something on our side that the Arabs who hate us do not have. And that is, we have the power of the truth, right? If we didn't have the power of the truth, we would not get the support we needed from certain players, including ourselves, the people of Israel, who decide whether or not what we are being told is true. And we know that we're being lied to by politicians about certain things, but we also know that there's truth about certain things. We all saw these truths with our own eyes, therefore you can't fool us all. And we also have the support of our friends around the world, those who understand the reality. Places like Europe and America and South America and Asia, Russia, and we've got citizens in those countries, even if we don't have all their politicians. Many citizens of those countries understand us and stand with us and stand with Israel, and are sick and tired of seeing Israel being treated unfairly by the liars, not just in the press, right, in the media. Okay, there's liars all over on both sides in the media. It doesn't matter. It's all intended to misinform and mislead and disinform, right? But by actual, we're seeing support from the right people, and we're seeing rejection and hatred from the usual suspects. So it doesn't surprise Israelis. And I would be, while I don't expect the Hamas to have an outright surrender, because they're just not that smart, that is an easy way to end this war. I mean, I've been saying it from the beginning. They can surrender. If they surrender, they will live in peace with Israel. No problem. They could surrender and come to acceptable terms. Unconditional surrender means you can build terms for peace in the future, just like Japan did, just like Germany did. These are the things that have happened over and over again. Napoleon's armies did it, surrendered to the British or the Russians or Polish or whoever was fighting in Europe. They've been fighting for a long time. Americans fought with a bunch of different armies who surrendered to them. The British surrendered, gave up the fight in the Revolutionary War. No, there's no end to the list of wars you could list where one side surrenders to the other, and then peace was established, and then the two nations ultimately became allies. Right? The French and the British fought so many wars against each other. Now they're some of the strongest allies in the world. Why is that? Because they stopped fighting. Why? Because ultimately one side surrendered to the other in the final battle that they had between them. And since then, they've been allies. And even before that, by the way, there was surrendering going back and forth between them, and they would be allies from time to time until they wouldn't be. But the last time they made peace was a very solid peace, and they've become very good allies since then. And by the way, the blood is so mixed between the French and the English is another reason that they're at peace, because their cultures are so mixed anyway. Even though English and French are very different languages, the cultures of England and France are very mixed, actually. If you actually look at the cultures and break it down, they're very close to each other geographically and by bloodline because they've been mixing for so long from the top. So that's not an accident. Beside from that, we have to keep in mind, those of us who want to see an end to stupid wars like the one we're seeing between Israel and Hamas, and yes, it's a stupid war, we have to keep in mind that the only way that this war will end is by either one, like truly end, is by one side surrendering to the other. And if it's Israel that surrenders, it's just going to be a genocide of Jews, right? And the jihadis are just going to finish the job, so to speak, that Hitler started, right? They're just going to murder every Jew, right? That's their goal. So that's not going to happen because Jews aren't going to suicide themselves. But the second time, on the other hand, the other way this can end is if the Palestinians who are launching these constant wars against Israel will surrender, because as soon as they do that, there will actually be peace. Israel has zero interest, and I mean zero interest, in killing anybody, especially not our own freaking cousins. Okay, Palestinians are the cousins of the Israelis, whether they like to say it or not. Right? Bloodline, whatever, genealogically, historically, culturally, there's a lot of ties between the Arabs of Araby and the Jews of Israel that go back centuries. Okay, and yes, one force was more of an invading force than the other. Namely, the Arabs invaded Araby. They weren't always the leading powers in these countries, but they became those leading powers. And for many centuries, a lot of them have mixed, with Jews and gotten married with Jews, etc. over the centuries. And there's a lot of cultural ties and historical ties and other ties, scientific ties, whatever, research ties, you name it. A lot of ties between Jews and Arabs. And so, therefore, it's not like the Jews have any interest in harming the people with whom we are so closely tied. These are the people who are our kin, essentially, and we're sick and tired of fighting them. And it's just a disgrace and a shame that we have to. But it's because that they're, the side that hates us, the side that hates Israel, is so bent on destroying and killing every last Jew. It's like horrendous and it comes down to miseducation. They've been miseducated. They've been horribly educated. Once they are willing to surrender and accept the loss, take the L, check that on their list. Okay, we lost that war, so what? We move on with our lives. We make peace and we move on with our lives. And we have a better future. Once they accept the loss and de-radicalize themselves and educate themselves to be not hateful against Jews in Israel, but to understand that we are their brothers and sisters, and to make peace with Israel, and to live in peace and harmony with Israel and prosperity, then there'll be peace and harmony and prosperity in the Middle East. It's really that simple. And people say it's going to take generations. I don't think it's going to take generations for them to de-radicalize and re-educate. Why? Because even the Nazis de-radicalized and re-educated themselves in a matter of a few years. And you'll say, well, the Nazis only hated the Jews for about 15 years or so, 20 years. Okay, well, what about Imperial Japan? Imperial Japan believed in thousands of years. And they gave up that idea very quickly, and they de-radicalized their ideology almost overnight. And they were able to turn to a new way of being practically overnight. And they were able to establish new education practically overnight. It did not take them generations. It didn't take the Germans anywhere near generations either. It didn't take them more than a couple of years to get rid of that nonsense from their heads. Even less than that. Within a year of losing the war, they'd given up on that nonsense completely, and only the most extreme outlier nut jobs still maintain these crazy beliefs today against the law in Germany, despite the fact that whatever they lost and everything else. There's still a few crazy people, even in Germany, who defy the law of Nazi ideology, which is illegal in Germany, but they still do it. They find ways for either loopholes or they just outright violate the law. But the overwhelming majority of Germans do not support that crazy ideology because they realize what a terrible thing it was, right? So that's how this has to end. Surrender and education. Until then, there's going to be conflict in the Middle East. I hate to say it, but that's the truth. And so there you go. Truth about lies. Hope you all have a great day. Take care.